Today we're going to talk about the Schell model of contextual-based teaching and learning, or learning and teaching, excuse me. It's going to be a four-part video. The first is going to be about the research supporting the model. The second is the model itself. The third is about cognitive apprenticeship, but that's going to focus more on the aspect of teaching and curriculum design for contextual-based learning. And the last part is just an illustration, a very brief illustration of the references supporting the materials. You will also have access to that in the copy of the book chapter on this topic. I'm making a video of it because some people like to watch a video, some people like to read the chapter. I would kind of encourage you to do both, because maybe I'll add some things in the video that's not in the book, or maybe there's things in the book that is not in the video. In fact, I know there's more in the book than there's in it. So, okay, let's move on to the first part, the supporting research. Now, the supporting research, and this comes with five basic areas of academic study in the area. One is we're going to begin with social constructivist theory, and that you might hear me call that dialectical constructivism at some point in the conversation. The other is all of Jean Lave and Wingers and Brown, Collins, and Dugan's work on situated learning theories. Then the other aspect, or maybe the aspirational aspect of this, is we're hoping that through a focus on critical thinking and reflection that we can promote some form of learning transfer. And we'll talk more about that as we go. The other is then we're going to talk about reflection and teaching. And the last part of it that will be in the second part of the or in the part two of the video is going to be on cognitive apprenticeship, and that's about teaching appropriate to this theory. So, okay, let's move on and take a look at some of these theories. And why do we do this? One of the things that we're aspirational about in contextual teaching and learning is to create an environment of higher order and critical thinking. So this is a hypertext, if you mind the old terminology here, that takes us over to a definition, which is conceptualizing, applying, and analyzing, synthesizing. You may recognize those words as words that you might put in a learning objective as higher order thinking. It's obtained by activities of observation, experience, reflection, reasoning, communication, as a guide to belief and action. Now, it's really interesting that both, if you remember, if you were with us last semester, our definition of reflection was about developing a form of action. Again, that comes up in this definition, and there are core elements of higher order thinking. One is learning transfer, which we're going to talk about a little bit later. Critical judgment, which is something else we're going to be talking about, and that's a little bit more about how we might use different types of evidence in different stages of development. And then we're all about creative thinking as a way of identifying, solving, and open-ended, and creating something new from our problem solving. So a little bit more, and this shouldn't be news to anybody by now. This is Bloom's taxonomy that was revised in 2009. Krathwohl revised Bloom's taxonomy, and if you remember the highlight, this remembering and understanding are probably the two most common things, maybe in high school, maybe, I don't know, maybe that's not fair, but these are what we call domain knowledge. We're going to have a term for it a little bit later. These are basic information. So you understand the basic information, you can remember it and recall it on an exam. So that's kind of that level. Now, what we're looking for is at least a minimum of application and analysis. So now that's going to move us up into this higher order process here. We want students to be able to judge and assess the value. But look at some of these some of these attributes that you might, action verbs that you might use in thinking about creating learning objectives. But evaluate and create are two of the higher order things. And if we're ambitious about learning transfer, we're going to be working at least in these three areas right here. All right, well, let's return back to our menu. I don't want to get hung up too much in this. Let's talk about what it means to be learning in context for a few minutes. Okay, learning in authentic, and the term authentic is, to me, has real meaning because it's realistic. It's the real thing. And so I'll talk more about the importance of that in just a minute. But at the very core of the foundation here, learning is a function of living. We, as human beings, we are natural learners. We have to learn to survive. And if we're not good at learning, we don't live as full and rich a life. So that is the kind of learning that we want to capture here, is that we want to get this natural learning going, and once we have natural learning going, the student engagement's going to fall right in there. So then I want to come back to that term of authenticity. Those are contexts that are critical to learning and the use of knowledge. And so as real as those can be, then students are going to see why they're learning algebra, for example. Now the question becomes, because we have some limitations in public schools, when is context real enough? It's a really interesting philosophical question. When is real enough to make a difference? I think that the realer, the better, if you pardon my poor grammar. And I'll explain a little bit more about that. But there's some kinds of compromises that we have to make. And the other thing the other point I want to make before I get to this important about this compromise is that learning is psychological and social. And the other thing that is important to these authentic contexts is the social dynamic. We learn in our heads psychologically, but we also learn from one another and from social engagement. Even if you're not a person who's overtly social, you still have a mechanism for social learning. And so we want to emphasize that in this approach. There's lots of academic arguments about which is more important. I tend to think that they're both important. I tend to lean more to social learning theories, but I'm just one guy. But here's the bottom line for this, I think. Make learning as real as possible, given the circumstances that you have. I know those are limited, we take in classrooms, but the essence of classrooms is that they're abstract and passive. So what we want to do is get over here where learners can learn to the extent that you can make it happen, to the extent that they can learn in an authentic situation. Now, not being able to do that, falls into the thing, can I do simulation? Can I do computer simulations? Can I do real situations? If you're in healthcare, sometimes they bring in health patients, actors, and that's a simulation, and it's fine. Sometimes the computer simulations, gaming, that kind of thing is on the continuum of being contextualized. So what we want you to be able to do is to move away from this abstract passive where the teacher gives all the information and students receive it and give it back, but we want that more engaged dynamic, and we'll talk more about that substantially as we go next. So, okay, enough about that for the moment. Let's go back to our menu here. Now, how do we teach in this thing? Well, we're going to go to, and we'll talk about this one in part 2, actually, but we're going to talk about cognitive apprenticeship. And it is a model. Basically, it's not a complete description of curriculum, but it's got some pretty important elements to it. And we're going to discuss in some detail what you teach, how you teach it, the sequence, what you teach to whom, when, and what it's like to have a sociology in the classroom, particularly if it's in an authentic environment. So, all right, enough on that, and because we're gonna have a whole video on this in the second part. So let's go back to our thing. One of the other things I've already began to talk about somewhat in this video is the issue of learning transfer. I'll just move myself over here so I don't block some of the screen. Use the knowledge or behaviors from one context or another. So if the challenge is to get students to be able to use information they learn here to apply it to a situation over there. And but one of the things that we find is that particularly in isolated and abstract classrooms, transfer is rare, and it is difficult to obtain. And in the next bullet thing, we're going to talk about how teachers can arrange for it. Now, the other thing I want to say is, and this may come up again in just a minute, is that there are different kinds of transfer. Theoretically, there are different kinds of transfer. There's near transfer, which is probably something that we can get close to obtaining. But far transfer is where I use this information to invent something else. That's I'm not going to say it's beyond what what our aspirations are, but I'm going to say that it's like an intellectual home run. Now, one of the things I want to say is that teachers arrange for transfer purposefully through instruction, where you can do that, but it takes a special kind of instruction where a learner utilizes prior and new knowledge surfaced via the learner, articulation, and systematic reflection. And we'll talk about those as dynamics. There's going to be about 3 different dynamics that we'll talk about here that might help you promote learning transfer. Okay, now, another piece of that is, we talked about articulation, systematic reflection, and teacher uses conversation approximations and a technique of scaffolding. So let's move back to our menu and pick up another topic here that we're going to be talking about, and that is assessing student learning. This is going to be in the third part of the model. And so I'll just go do that, and maybe I'll just do this now, and we won't have this in the third part of the video. Okay, so assessment here is going to be a little bit different. Sometimes these kind of social interactions are not lend themselves to measurement very well. So, but let's think about this higher order learning here. At the program level, at the CATE program in your school, how does your curriculum philosophy align with your instructional philosophy? And do you expect higher order thinking skills? And how do you arrange for that in terms of learning objectives and teaching practices, and then assessment strategies like authentic assessment, that kind of thing? Okay, at the classroom level, much of this is of these higher order learning skills become viable when they're expected. And you expect them through the beginning, you expect them through your objectives and the action verbs that are consistent with the objectives. And that refer back to the old Bloom's taxonomy thing here. The assessment of student performance is another way of thinking about this. Okay, let's move on here and we'll get back to it. Now we want to think about giving formative assessment, which gives direction to the future. I do that a lot in my approach to learning. For example, developmental writing. As you come into a master's and a doctoral program, you probably are not used to technical writing, and that takes a little while to kind of get that, and it takes several reiterations of things and over different classes. And so I approach that, and I think many of our professors in our department do this, is that we know that this is going to be a project that's going to take a while, and we're going to get you over uh, at a more competent level by feedback. Now, the other thing is that observation reflection on the actions, and that those reflections are purposeful, and that we have a purpose when we engage in reflection. Then the summative session, like how do you do it in the classroom? It's often done with multiple choice. That wouldn't be my first choice of things to do. But you can use constructive responses where students use thinking skills to real world problems. You can use essay and logic and creativity, and analytic reviews, so students can compare separate criteria for each thinking task. Okay, I don't want to get particularly hung up in assessment here, and if we bring it up in the class, it'll be towards the end of the semester. But I just wanted you to be aware that assessment in a contextual teaching and learning thing is maybe a little bit different than if you're looking for recall or understanding, and that you might have to think about the assessment strategies differently. So, okay, well, let's go back to the menu. All right, so those are the main pieces, and this is just going to basically wrap up the first part of the first part of the video. And so in the next video, then we're going to talk about the Schell model for contextual learning and teaching. So hang on, it's coming.